Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Amanda, and I focus on budget meals, homemaking, canning, and urban homesteading. Today, I am going to be focusing on building up my pantry and making some ready-to-go meals in a jar. I will be canning up 7 meals, 3 different recipes. One is Salsa verde chicken, Chipotle beef, and some beef stroganoff. Having ready-to-go meals is so handy for those busy days where you just want to throw together something healthy but easy and quick. So having these jars in the pantry is a must. I know pressure canning can be very intimidating, but it's actually incredibly easy as long as you respect your canning equipment and do things properly. So come along with me and I'm going to show you exactly how I put together these meals. These recipes were taken from the all-new Ball Book of Canning and Preserving. So if you're looking for those recipes, make sure you check out that book. All right, let's get canning. I am starting off with the beef stroganoff. This recipe calls for 2 quarts. So I am using some stewing beef here, but you can use whatever beef you have that's cubed up. You'll need 2 pounds, so 1 pound per jar. I like to use the wide mouth canning jars whenever I'm using a recipe with meat in it, especially meals, just because when you go to open the jar and get the meal out, it's a heck of a lot easier with the wide mouth jars. But it's fine if you use the regular mouth jars, it's just a little bit harder to get the meal out of. Next, the recipe calls for 1 cup of chopped mushrooms, and I'm going to divide that equally between my jars. So a half a cup of mushrooms per jar. Having the wide mouth jars is also a little bit easier to get your hands in and push the ingredients down a bit. I find especially recipes with mushrooms in them, it starts to stack up pretty easily and you need to kind of push down everything to get all your ingredients in nicely. Next, I have 1 cup of onions diced up, and I'm going to split this again between my jars. So a half a cup of onions per jar. I'm just eyeballing it instead of measuring it. I figure I get pretty much half cup each jar. Next, the recipe calls for 4 tablespoons of tomato paste, so 2 tablespoons per jar. So these are all going to be new recipes for me. I'm really interested to see how my family likes them. This beef stroganoff, I feel like I'll probably serve this with some pasta, but I'm super happy to be getting these all in my pantry to have some easy to make ready meals. Next, I'm adding 4 tablespoons of Worcester sauce, so 2 tablespoons per jar again. I know how we pronounce the name of this sauce is highly debatable. For me, I grew up saying Worcester sauce, but I know some say Worcestershire and Worcestershire. How do you say Worcester sauce? How would you pronounce that? Let me know in the comments. All right, next I have 2 cloves of garlic diced up, so I'm just eyeballing 1 clove of garlic per jar. And on to our spices, I have 2 teaspoons of thyme, 1 teaspoon per jar. Next, I have parsley. Again, 1 teaspoon per jar, 2 teaspoons total. So here I'm just pushing all the ingredients down, and I kind of wished at this moment that I had pushed them down earlier because I kind of got the tomato paste all over my spatula, so it kind of made a mess of things. So if you're going to push all your ingredients down, I would say put your tomato paste in last before the beef broth, just so it doesn't create a bit of a mess like mine did. Lastly, we are adding beef broth into our mixture, and we are going to add it up, covering all the ingredients until there is 1 inch of headspace. Once that's in, you need a wooden or a plastic tool. Some use skewers or chopsticks. This is the end of my spatula that I'm using. And you just want to press all the ingredients down, mix them up a bit to make sure there's absolutely no air bubbles in your mixture. Once that's done, you may need to add a little bit more beef broth to get back to your 1 inch of headspace. It is important to make sure that there's no air bubbles because it could affect the seal. And the 1 inch of headspace is also important because during the canning process, there's a vapor lock that happens where it sucks out all of the oxygen from your can or your jar. And if you have too much headspace or not enough headspace, then that could cause siphoning or having not all the oxygen getting out of the jar and false seals. So make sure that you're measuring your headspace. I know I'm not in this picture, but I will show you in my next recipes here that I measure to make sure that there is definitely 1 inch of headspace here. Next, you're going to want to take a rag soaked with vinegar and wipe off the top of your jars. The vinegar will cut any fat that might hamper the seal. And while you are wiping, you can inspect your jars to make sure that there's no nicks or cracks or anything like that that might stop your seal. Now I'm taking 2 new clean lids and placing them on my jars and putting my rings on finger tight. You don't want to over tighten your jars just in case they buckle. Now I've just put those 2 jars to the side while I get my other recipes canned. We are moving on now to my Chipotle beef recipe. This recipe also calls for 2 pounds of cut up beef. I am using stewing beef for this recipe again because I got it on sale. And so I am putting 1 pound of beef in per jar. Next, I have 2 cups of diced onions. So I'm going to put 1 cup of onions per jar. It's important to note that when you are pressure canning, you're going to want to make sure that your jars are clean. But as of new regulations, you no longer have to sterilize them beforehand as they kind of get sterilized in the pressure canner when they are canning. You also want to make sure that your jars are the temperature that your canner is going to be when you put your jars in there to keep them from cracking or breaking. So when I get my jars in my canner is going to start off with just some lukewarm water, nothing hot, because my jars are not hot. So in this recipe, I'm making sure that after my onions are in, I am pushing everything down to make sure that I've got enough room for my next ingredients. I have 8 cloves of garlic here, so 4 cloves of garlic each jar. It's diced up small, and I'm just going to eyeball my garlic here to make sure that it's even per jar. I'm definitely excited to try this recipe out. This is the Chipotle beef recipe. I love anything with chipotles or chilies or with a Mexican flavor to it. I'll probably be serving this one up with some rice. Unfortunately, my grocery store did not have a couple of the ingredients that I was looking for, so I'm hoping that I can sub them out and have them taste just as good. Now, I was supposed to have a half a cup of cilantro for this recipe, so a quarter cup each jar. Unfortunately, my grocery store was completely out of cilantro, so I have a half a cup of parsley here. We're going to make do with that, and hopefully it tastes good as well. Next, I'm adding 1 teaspoon per jar of salt, although I'm sure if you don't want the salt, you could leave that out. Next, I was supposed to have 2 chipotles in adobo for these recipes. Unfortunately, that was another ingredient I could not find. So I'm using 1 tablespoon per jar of chili powder. Again, I also didn't even have chipotle powder. So fingers crossed, it still tastes just as good. Next, I'm adding 2 teaspoons of oregano or 1 teaspoon per jar. And after that, we are filling our ingredients with some beef broth. I'm using beef broth that I had canned earlier. If you're looking for how to do that, I do have a video on how to can beef broth. check out my canning playlist, and I will link it in the description. So once again, I am making sure that I fill to 1 inch of headspace, and then I debubble with my wooden spatula end and make sure that I have no bubbles, and then fill again until there's 1 inch of headspace. So you will note that I am doing 3 different recipes in my canner at the same time. This is not a problem because all of them are processing for the exact same time. So all of them will be processing for 90 minutes. If there was a discrepancy in time, I would not be able to do this. So I'm not so worried about any flavors getting crossed or anything like that because it's all beef broth with 1 chicken broth. I think it will be fine. But as long as they're processing the same time, it's not a problem. So you can see that I just measured to make sure I had 1 inch of headspace. You can get a specific tool for this if you're needing the help just to make sure you've got 1 inch. Next, I am making sure that I am wiping off the top of my lids with vinegar and checking to make sure there's no cracks or blemishes. Once again, I get new clean lids and put my rings on fingertip tight. Next, we're moving on to our Salsa Verde chili. This recipe calls for 2 pounds of diced up chicken breast, 1 pound per jar. This is the recipe that I am most excited about because I do it with Salsa Verde, and Salsa Verde is one of my absolute favorite salsas. I love having it with tacos or burritos or anything like that. So I'm very excited to have that. Next, I am taking 1 cup of cut up green onion or a half a cup of green onion per jar. Again, I'm just eyeballing it to make sure that I've got a half a cup each. Next, I have 4 tables of cilantro, but once again, I do not have cilantro for this recipe as my grocery store was out, so I am using parsley. So once again, hoping that parsley is a good substitute for cilantro. I am one of those crazy people who absolutely loves cilantro. I would have it on everything, so I'm kind of missing the cilantro here. Now we have 2 cloves of garlic, so 1 clove per quart jar, diced up. I am so thankful to my friends who live in Northern Ontario and have a farm. They grow the most wonderful produce and they shared some of their garlic with us this year. So I am so thankful to have that, and that's what I'm using in this recipe today. Next, I have 1 cup of cooked white kidney beans that I'm adding here. So a half a cup per quart jar of cooked beans, as well as 1 cup of salsa verde, so a half a cup per jar of salsa verde. This recipe also calls for 2 teaspoons of salt, but I left it out on this recipe as I have salt added to my chicken broth that I've canned earlier. Once again, I have a video on canning chicken broth, so go ahead and check it out. I'll link it in the description. So once again, we are filling our jars with chicken broth to the 1 inch headspace mark. And then you're going to take your plastic or wooden tool and debubble your jar, putting the tool down the sides of the jar and thoroughly mixing things together to make sure that there are no air bubbles. Once you are done debubbling, make sure that you add liquid to get back up to that 1 inch headspace. The liquid needs to cover any of the ingredients that are in your jar. You can go ahead and take your tool and make sure that you have that 1 inch headspace before getting your clean new lids to put on top. Also remembering to make sure that you wipe off the top of your lids with vinegar to cut any of that fat from the meat, and make sure you're inspecting your jars for any cracks or blemishes. Once your lids are on, you can screw your rings on fingertip tight. So I have 2 inches of water in my American canner, as that is what the instructions call for. You're going to want to make sure that you read your instruction manual for the canner that you have and follow those instructions. Like I said, this water is lukewarm. It is not hot, so my jars are safe to go in here. So I had one space left when I was filling my canner jar, and that just will not do. So I made one more beef stroganoff to make sure that I was able to fill my canner. So you're going to want to make sure that your canner lid is locked in as well as tightened and on a level surface. This is an all-American canner, so I am tightening these knobs evenly and making sure that it's even between all the areas. Once that's done, I'll get it on the heat. I'm going to make sure that steam is coming out of that little spout for 10 minutes straight before I get my pound gauge on. Now, depending on your altitude, that will depend what kind of pound gauge you need. The recipe calls for 10 pounds, but at my altitude, I am using 15 pounds to can this. Once that little thing is going, that's when I start my timer, and I can for 90 minutes. Once that 90-minute timer goes off, then I just shut off the heat. I do not touch my canner. I let it come down to zero pressure all on its own. I give it typically at least 2 hours before I touch it, and I make sure I look at the gauge to make sure it is at zero before I take the lid off. All of these canned up really beautifully, and they all sealed up perfectly. All right, so those were the 3 recipes that I used to help stock up my pantry with some nice, easy, ready-to-go meals. I will be trying more of these in the future, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and follow along. If you are looking for more canning recipes, make sure you check out my canning playlist that I will link right here. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you guys next time.